Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you? Shavua
Baruch
Tov.
Hashem, Shabbat Tov. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so we're concluding the chapter here. It says in the Torah. Yasina b'menachot. So it's brought down in the Masechet Menachot, Gemara Menachot. Tabla, pirush lash matzah, leketzach, v'shum shumin, u'bechol minei tablim. So what he did was, right, he kneaded the matzah with all kinds of spices and sesame and stuff like this. So the shira, it's kosher. Kivan sheyesh batam matzah. Why is that? Because it has a taste of matzah still. V'katuv b'sefer harokiach, it says in this book, "B'kom makom en niten bat pilpelin," but it says don't put pepper in there, right? Lefi shehu cham mechamem mesa. So what's the reason why? Because pepper tends to, raise the temperature, make it hot. So therefore we should avoid pepper. But it seems like the other spices are okay. So it depends on what it is, Interesting.
Kavod Harav, what are the spices? We said it was salt and pepper, right? And sesame does not
Yeah,
raise
salt we don't use. Pepper we don't use, right?
garlic.
We didn't talk about garlic yet. Let's see what it says in the Beit Yosef.
Okay, thank you.
So here we go. So it says the Beit Yosef, Perak HaKometz Rabbah. Where is this? Menachot Chav Gimel Amud Bet. B'Ketava Rosh. The Rosh writes this. Ve'amor lechi b'Perek Kol Sha'ah. Also, this rabbi, V'chen Katav Rambam. Also the Rambam, Perek Hey, Katav Rabbah. It says Ravad, the Mishetavla Mishenafet Meire. So it says, he says it's talking about that you put the spices after the baking. Because otherwise it would be rich matzah with spices, with flavors. Then yotzin by dechova says you can't fulfill your obligation with that for matzah. Katab Rav Magid says Rav Magid, but shedochaku lamaken. So he says that it's forced just to say such a thing like that. That we're talking about after the baking. Good. So it seems to me more likely like this. And also read the lechem oni matzah shira. That when it comes to say bread of poverty, it's not coming to exclude rich bread. It's coming to exclude not to use second maser, right? Like this rabbi, Perek Kol Sha'ah, and over there is Perek Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. V'lo kaim alan kibateh says we don't hold like that anyway. So it says, nevertheless, we see from here one thing, that spices do not cause leavening, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about the other spices, right? Because we already said that pepper does, right? Anyway, katuv b'sefer harokiach. So it says in the pepper in this book, as we said, right? You shouldn't put pepper in there. Gama rosh hevi devarav v'perek kol sha'ah. The Rosh also brings this down, right? In this parak. Okay, good. So that's the end of the Beit Yosef, which is the Vav. So we'll see the Shulchan Aruch. So he says right again, Lasha matzah beketzach v'shumshumim u'bein tavlin, right? So he needed the matzah, as we said, right, with all kinds of spices and sesame and all kinds of stuff. Kshira, it's kosher. Why is that? Kevan sheyesh batam matzah, because it still has the taste of matzah there. מכל מקום, אין לי תן בתבלין, לפי שהוא חד ומחמם עיסה. Oh, so interesting, right? So here, in the Shulchan Aruch, he says you shouldn't put spices, right? Because it heats up the dough, right? So the truth is, right, that it's interesting because in the Bet Yosef, we talked about pepper, but here he's talking about spices. So the question is, how did that happen, right? How do we go from pepper to spices? It seems like there's a contradiction here. Something is a little bit off. So let's see the Mishnah Berurah if he explains anything about this. I'm just wondering what he says about this, because this is not the way we saw it over there. Right, so he says here, so Mishnah Berurah explains it like this, right? The way he explains it, he says that even though, putting spices in there, as we said, right, it's not really a big deal. But he says, lechatchila, right, preferably you shouldn't put spices in there. So that's the way he explains the Shulchan Aruch. Interesting, right? Okay. That's one way of looking at it. Let's see what else we can scrounge up here. I mean, the truth is, it makes sense what he's saying because in all honesty, in all honesty, I mean, spices do, they do heat up the situation. They usually make things hotter. Okay, interesting. So let me just take a look at the Mishnah Berurah a little bit more. There's more sections here. See how he explains everything. Okay. That's pretty much our scope in terms of the Mishnah Berurah. Seems like we've covered pretty much. But here's what the Ramah says, right? So he says, right, that the Ramah, that when it comes to pepper, right, it's even forbidden b'diavad. Seed, right? Also, he says if there fell in there some seed, right? What is seed? Seed means like limestone, which is very sharp. So probably causes it to leaven. So right, how do we sum this up, right? This whole thing. It seems like when it comes to other spices, right, lechatchila, you shouldn't put it. But when it comes to pepper, even b'diavad, even after the fact, it's a problem. So you shouldn't eat it at all if you put pepper in there, So you got to be careful with pepper. But as we already said, right, that nowadays nobody puts anything in the matzah except bread, except flour and water. That's all you got in there. So nobody adds anything into matzah today. Except what? That if you're making, right, the matzah, like matzah ashira, which is rich matzah, right? So what is matzah ashira? If you're kneading the dough, instead of using water, you're using fruit juice, right, or wine, or eggs, right, things like this. That's called matzah ashira. So that is kosher for Passover, especially for the Sfardim. The Ashkenazim are a little bit more hesitant to eat that stuff. They only give it to older people or children or whatever. They're a little bit stringent about that. When it comes to the Sfardim, we do eat matzah shira, but we can't use it for the mitzvah. For the mitzvah, what is the mitzvah? When you eat it for the first night, right? And the second night as well, in the diaspora. So when you eat that, special kazait for the mitzvah, you need to have not matzah shira. You have to have regular matzah with just flour and water. So yeah, that's the situation. Okay. So I guess we'll go on to the next piece, if there is any more. The chapter may be finished. Let's see. Yeah, I think the chapter is finished. So we'll go to the next chapter, which is Taf Nun Vav, right? 456. Okay. Yeah, so let's start with the tour. So it says, שיעור העיסה של פסח של השין בפעם אחד היא מן ג' ביצים וחומש ביצה בינונים, וכן יישאר אותה ימלא כלי מים וייתן אותה לתוך כלי לכאן, ויכניס לתוכו מ' ג' ביצים בנחת אחד לאחד, והמים היוצאים כלי המחזיק אותם הוא שיעור עמידה, או ימלא כלי מים וירא המים ממנו לכלי אחר, אחר כך ייתן בה מ' ג' ביצים. Okay, so what is he saying over here, right? That what is the size of the dough that we can do in one shot? In other words, it seems like this is like the maximum you can do in one shot. To make one dough on Passover, this is the maximum size. So how much is it? It's 43 1/5 of an egg. In other words, 43 eggs and 1/5. So why do we have a maximum amount? What's the reason why? Anybody know? So the reason is because if you make the dough too big, it can become leavened, because it's just too large to manage. So therefore, we don't want the dough to be too large, because you gotta manage it. So what does that mean to manage it? We're going to talk about this, upcoming now, all these kinds of things. But the idea is like this, right? You want to have, a controlled amount of dough that you can work, and knead, and get it into the oven, right? In a quick, quick amount of time. It's a short amount of time. You have to promptly get it into the oven, So, right, what's the rule? The rule is you're supposed to have it ready for getting into the oven not more than 18 minutes, right? Because once you wait 18 minutes, it's going to start rising. It's going to start leavening. So therefore, right, the rule is you gotta have a manageable amount of dough that is not going to, leaven and take you too long to right to knead it into shape. This is the reason why we don't want to use too much. Okay, I'm just telling you my personal from my personal knowledge. Right now, let's see what it says here. So by the way, just to let you know, we calculate nowadays um, that each egg, right, size is about 50 grams. So therefore, right, what do we have over here? How many grams do we have? Right, we have 50 times 40, right? So that's 2,000. And then we have another three, right? So, which is 150. So, what are we talking about? 2150, approximately, right? Which is what? It's about 2.25 kilos, right, of dough, which is about 5 pounds, something like that, right? More or less, right? So that's what we're talking about. Right? We're talking about a pretty large amount. It's pretty 5 pounds. It's pretty big. So what are we telling you? Don't make it bigger than that, right? As we said. Okay. So let's go on. So here, right, the Torah tells you how to calculate this, But what I just gave you a nice shortcut here, right? Which is that we have like in the books written down that this is the measure that we go by, more or less, right? So what does that mean? Each egg is 50 grams. 52, 54, 50, whatever, something in that ballpark, right? So let's round it off to 50, right? As we said. So that's what we're talking about. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. So he says, "Katav Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yehuda." This rabbi says, "Shezu hamidah hi dafka lerishonim shetanurehem ayu ktanim." So he says this measure applies to the older generations, right? Why is that? Because they had small ovens. So he says, therefore, we're concerned, about heating up the dough, about tanurim. But it says when it comes to our ovens, Shem Doni, we have larger ovens, right? Adif tefei shelush harbe biyachad. So he says when it comes to when you have a larger oven, he says actually better to knead like a large amount together. You asukim beisat tamid, and you're going to be like working the dough, right? Shelot tavo lidei chimutz. So this way it shouldn't come to leaven, right? So what does that mean? What is he trying to tell you, right? As long as you're working the dough, in other words, you're moving it around, playing with it with your hands, manipulating it. It doesn't leaven, It only leavens when you let it rest. So that's why, right? You want to keep playing with this thing, all the time until you get it into the oven. This way it won't leaven. Okay, good. But he says the other rabbis don't agree with this. He says, in other words, they don't agree that this measure was only given for a small oven, like he says, right? But not for a big one. So he says, if you did more than this, right? Let's say you did more. As we said, right? We're talking about 5 pounds, approximately. So if you did more than 5 pounds, right? What do we tell you, right? What do we tell you to do with this thing? Are you allowed to use it or not, right? B'diavad, after the fact. So he says, Chachmet Tzarfat hayu osrim oto. So he says the rabbis in France would forbid it. So in other words, they would make you throw it away, basically, right? Or sell it to a goy, whatever, right? You can't use it. Can't eat it on Passover. Right? By the way, what I told you is sold to a goy, that only applies before Passover, right? But during Passover, it's too late to do that. You can't really sell it to a goy during Passover. So, depends on the timing as well. Anyway, right? But he says, it seems to me that it's allowed to have it, even if you made it larger. According to the Geonim, it says, right? So they said, right, the Geonim, that, as we said, right, you shouldn't even leave the dough one moment without, working it. You got to keep working it all the time. Always playing with it, moving it around, squeezing it, right, twisting it, this, right, always manipulating it around. That's what you should do, in order that it shouldn't leaven. Okay. below עסק. אם כן, לכתחילה אין הלוש יותר מזה השיעור. So therefore, right, לכתחילה, you shouldn't do larger than this, right? In other words, don't do more than 5 pounds. Approximately. עד כאן, ולזה הסכים אדוני אבי רושל. So the Rosh agreed with this. Good, okay. So what does that mean? It seems like he agrees, the Rosh, that b'diavad, you could eat that. You don't have to throw it away or whatever, or sell it to a goy. Okay, that's the tool. So let's take a look at the Bet Yosef. I read already most of the chapter here. So let's see what the Bet Yosef says here. So says Bet Yosef, where is the source for this? Elu Ovrin, right over there in Memchet Amud Bet in the Gemara. Amar Rava Kava milugna'a lepascha v'chen lechala uperesh Rashi. So the Gemara says, right, this language. So Rashi explains, what does that mean? Kava milugna kav shel otom makom. In other words, you got to use for Passover, right? The largest size you can use is the kav, right, which is a measure from that place, which is called the lugna. The Pesach, right, for Passover. So explains Rashi, what does that mean? You shouldn't do more than that, right? Don't need a dough larger than that. Because if you do, right, as we said, right, you're gonna you have to guard it from leavening, so don't make it larger than that. It says also for challah. So it's the same thing also when it comes to, right, being obligated for challah. The same amount. Okay, interesting. Katav Rashi. The Alfinan, Rashi says, right, we learn in Eruvin, Pegim Lamud Bet, Mikra, from the verse, we learn this in the Bamidbar, and it says over there, Shi'ur Isa Leitchayev Bechala. We learn how much is the size of the dough which is obligated for challah. Havia Shiv'a Revi'i Kav Revi'a Kav. It's right, 1 3/4 of a kav. Midbarim, right, from the desert, right, the measure of the desert. וביצה, וחומש ביצה, and then also another egg and 1/5 egg. וכל רוב הקו מהן הוא 6 ביצים. So he says their quarter of a calf is six eggs. עולה 43 ביצים בחומש. So that equals 43 eggs and the fifth. Okay, so that's a little bit smaller than what we saw before. No, maybe it's the same thing. The same thing. כתב רבי ירוחם. says רבי ירוחם. וכך מודדים אותה לוקח ביצים בינונית ונוקבה ומוציא מה שבתוכה, ממלא מים 43 פעמים, ובאותם המים משימים בכלי המחזיק אותו המים, היא עמידה עד כאן ישנו. So he says, right, how do you measure this? So he says, what you do is, you do it, by volume, right? Calculating the volume by putting water in there and seeing how much water it holds, that volume. כתב גם כן הדרך הראשון שכתב רבנו, he also writes the first way the Rabbeinu wrote, כתב והכל עולה למידה אחד או בקירוב, right? So he says it's all the same size, more or less, right? All these different approaches that we just made here. More or less, it's the same. Okay. So then he goes on. כתב עוד, ואל תטעה כי יש טועים במים ואומרים, כי אותם המים הם ללוש. So he says, don't make a mistake. Why? Because he says there are those that make mistakes with the water. And he said, what does that mean? That they think that water we just explained, right, regarding the displacement, is talking about the water that you use to knead the flour. So he says, and then whenever you can use that water to mix with flour, that's going to be the size, right? So that means the size will be a lot larger like that. The Khalila Ella says that's not the right way, not the right approach. So he says, right, he says we're talking about the displacement altogether and not just the water, right? Because otherwise there will be a much larger displacement. Because the flour is not included according to that. Okay. But the truth is, right, that the flour should be included in the displacement. So we're talking about a lot less when it comes out like that. Okay, so then it goes on. Katav Rambam, right? It says the Rambam. בפירוש המשנה, בפרק כמה דעדויות, right? In the Perush Mishnah, שמצא שיעור החלה מקמח חיטה מצרית. So he says he found the size of the challah with the Egyptian flour, right? Derhem, right? מצרים בקירוב. וכן כתב גם כן פרק ו' מהלכות ביקורים. So the Rambam says, right, that he has a measure, right? So what are we talking about? Taf kuf chaf derhem. Right, so derhem is an Egyptian measure. By the way, it's still around today. Same thing today as it was before. Can you imagine? Hasn't changed for 1,000 years, right? They're very traditional over there. These Arab countries, nothing changes over there. Everything remains the same. So, right, that's the way it is. So he says, right, that this measure, the way he measured it, turns out to be 122 dirham. So dirham, right? How much is that in our measure? So, right, there's a lot of books that have written about this, in our generation, but the prevailing opinion seems to be that the dirham is 3 grams. So, if you times it by 122, right? 122 times 3. So that turns out to be a lot less than what we had before, right? The way the Rambam does it. Much smaller. So we're talking about what? About 400 grams. Right? So that's much less than what we were talking about before. Before we were talking about 2,000. Interesting. So let's see, right, if we can figure out what the discrepancy is here. So the Rambam, this is the way he does it. כתב רבנו בטור יורד דעה, סימן שכ"ד. So says the tour, על מידת שיעור חלה, ומשערין אותה לפי התבואה. So he says, regarding, the measure of chala, we do it according to the size of the volume of the grains, אבל לא לפי הקמח, not the flour, he says, but the grains. על פי שהן יותר, משאלו היו משערין אותה בקמח. Turns out to be more when you do grains, right? Because there's airspace there, right? But when it comes to flour, there's no airspace, everything is full. לכן, כשממלאים המידה קמח צריך לגדשה. So he says, therefore, when you're using, right, flour as your measure, you have to over measure a little bit. Why is that? Because, as we said, right, that the grains are going to come out to be a little bit larger. So you got to do an over measure a little bit. How do you do that? By filling it up like beyond the rim, like a little bit on top, over measure on top. That's the way you got to do it. So that turns out to be like, let's say, I don't know, for argument's sake, right? Like 5% more than the regular measure, right? Something like that, right? I'm just giving an approximation. So yeah. לכאורה היה נראה ל5 רבעים יש למודדן בתבואה, שכן הייתה עיסת מדבר, מלוא האומר, היו מלקטין, ואחר כך תוכנו בלחיים, וראיתי באשכנז שאנשים גודשות כקמח לשיעור חלה, ותליתי הדבר בשביל שנפח הקמח רב מנפח מנפח התבואה, וקצת משמע כן לישנה במתיתין. So he says the same thing right over here, repeats it over, what we just said, which is, right, that since the real measure is supposed to be by grains, so therefore when you measure it by flour, it's going to turn out to be, a larger measure. So therefore, right, he says, I saw that the ladies were, over measuring it, putting it on the brim, beyond the brim, right? So that's, that's the reason, right? Because it's supposed to be grains and not flour. Okay. Good. Then he goes on. So it's a little bit implied from the language of the Mishnah, right? Chala, Perek Aleph. But he says it's not really a source for sure. But Perek Bet, in the Perek Bet, he says over there, Tanah, we learned in the Mishnah there, Chameshet Revaim Kemach, right? We're talking about 1 1/4, right? Of Revaim, right? Which is a measure of flour. Chayavim Bechala. It's obligated in Chala. Alma Bekemach Misharinan. So he says, you see from there that we actually measure by flour and not by grains. But it says in the Chuvot, right, the same rabbi, Katav Sheshal Rashba, he says that he asked the Rashba this question, right? This is language, right, that he uses there. Let me just see who this was. 1 second. Yeah, this is the Rosh. Okay, the Rosh says this. Okay. So, yeah. So says the Rosh that he asked the Rashba, right? So here's the thing, right? The Rosh and the Rashba were pretty much in the same generation. That's why they were able to do correspondence between them, right? What was the difference? The Rosh lived in Germany, right? And Rashba lived in Spain. But what happened was, right, that once the Rashba passed away, who was older than the Rosh, right, then in Spain they didn't have a chief rabbi there, so they brought the Rosh there to be the chief rabbi of Spain, So in the end, right, the Rosh wound up in Spain somehow. This is what happened, even though he was German by descent. right? So yeah, this is the story. So he asked him a question, right? The Rosh to the Rashba. יבנני מה שראיתי מר כל רבותיי נוהגים שמשערים מידה המחזקת 4 או 3 ביצים לשיעור חלה ומודדים בו קמח תפופה או מחוקה לכיוון דמאיסת המדבר מילפינן ומדדו המן באומר תחנוהו ברחיים מסתמא כי נתוסף הרבה גם כן היה לשערו רציך קמח הנטחן מ5 רבעים תבואה 5 רבעים למסכת חלה יהיה פירושו קמח הבא מ5 רבעים תבואה ואל יגדשו מידה ניחא תפי כי ספק ברכה לבטלה עיקר עד כן שלום. So he's asking the Rashba a question like this, right? His question is, what's the reason why, they overmeasure this measure, So he says the truth is that it should not be overmeasured. So in other words, he doesn't seem to understand, right? What's the reason for the overmeasure, as we just mentioned? וכיוון שראה רבנו שדעת הראש לחלה בעניין שתהיה למידה קדושה, משום ספק ברכה לבטלה, וגם שאנשים באשכנז, I'm sorry, so I didn't say it right? Let me just rephrase that. So what happened was that the Rosh is saying, right, that it should be overmeasured. So he says, I saw people that don't overmeasure it, but he holds that it should be. So therefore, right, says the Beit Yosef here, that the Rosh holds that it has to be overmeasured, and that's why the Tur, who was his son, right, also wrote that it should be overmeasured. So why is that? Because, we're concerned that if you don't overmeasure it, this is the problem, right? You're going to make a blessing when you take the challah, so it's going to be a blessing in vain. This is the problem. So that's why, we want to make sure we have enough there, to make the blessing, and separate the challah with the blessing. Because if there's not enough there, you're making a blessing, it's a blessing in vain. That's what the Beit Yosef is saying here. So also, right, as we said, he says that the ladies in Germany were also overmeasuring it. So it says, right, that it has to be overmeasured. But since he said this because of a doubt, בתשובה וגם בהלכות חלב מספק עליה סיפוקי משמע דלעניין פסח לא בריא שצריכה להיות קדושה. So he says, therefore, right, since he says that he has to overmeasure because of a doubt, so he says, therefore, when it comes to the laws of Passover, right, we're not sure if it has to be overmeasured. מפני כך לא הזכיר רבנו בעניין פסח שתהיה עמידה קדושה. So therefore, he says, the Torah doesn't say regarding Passover, right, that it has to be overmeasured. Like we said regarding challah. Why? Because he goes regarding challah, he goes stringent. But here, there's not so much need for astringency in Passover. Why is that? Because it's a different context altogether, right? First of all, there's no blessing in vain involved here, like we're talking about with challah. That's one thing, right? Another thing is that we said, right, that this is the maximum of you can make. For Passover, right? You can't make more than that. So therefore, right, if you overmeasure it, just the opposite, right? You're being lenient and not stringent, so this is a different ballgame altogether. It's not the same thing. So therefore, it's not relevant here to overmeasure. But when it comes to, the size of challah, over there, it's relevant to overmeasure. Okay, good. Let's go on. מתוך מה שראיתי תשובת הרשב"א לראש נראה לעניין החלה נמי, he says, what I saw that how the Rashba answered the Rosh that regarding challah also לא הביא המידה קדושה, that it should not be overmeasured, right, when it comes to Passover. שהרי השיבו והשיבו לזנו, this language of the Rashba, אם כדעתי דמור אי אפשר לעמוד על שיעורו דמנן כמה היה מתרבה המן, וודאי אין לך תבואה יפה כמן, בכל מין ומין מתרבה לפי מינו, ואין ריבוי השיעורים כריבוי החיטים, ואין ריבוי הרעות כיפות שבעניין עצמו, ונתת דבריך לשיעורים ואינו. So he says, the Rashba tells the Rosh, right, he answers him like this, regarding his question. He tells him, listen, when it comes to this issue of Passover, right? He says it doesn't really come out to be a standard size, if because it depends on what kind of grains you're using. Each grain has its own size that it over measures. Okay, interesting. So anyway, so he says, therefore, if you do this, it will not come out to be some kind of uniform measure. This is a problem. It's going to be depending on the type of grain. That's what he says. So he says also, we're going to explain that's what we said, that you have to measure with 1.25 of revaim, right? These are the measures. Has to be 5 quarters of revaim of flour. It says also, if you're talking about blessing in rain, as we said, right here, it comes out to be different, right? Here, as we said, it comes out to be a leniency, not a stringency, right? Just the opposite of what we talked about in Chala. לעתים דלא הבו לו אלא 5 רבעים לבד ופטר לו מחלה וכך אכיל בטבלה וכהיד ימינא בקידושין פרק האיש מקדש כבה המפריש חלתו קמח ועוד דעתי כולה בפסח ללוש עיסה מרובה אלא אין לך בו אלא 5 רבעים קמח. So he says, therefore the Rashba answers him, right? Bottom line is that you shouldn't over measure this, he says, when it comes to the issue of Passover. Just leave it the way it is. So what does that mean? Right, make an exact measure, an even up to the brim measure, right, which is 5 revaim of flour, right, evenly measured. שבשיעור האומר אמרה התורה, לא בשיעור קמח הבא מ5 רבעים תבואה עד קנה שנה. הרי וגם לעניין חלה לא תהיה קדושה, וכל שכן לעניין פסח. So he says, right, that he really holds the Rashba, that you don't have to overmeasure it in either way, right? Whether it's Chala or Passover, right? There's no need to overmeasure. So it's also the Rosh himself, the laws of Chala, that he says, right, that the women used to overmeasure when it comes to the flour. And he gave him reason, דאם כן אין מודדין אותה בקדושה אפילו על חלה וכן בכל שכן בפסח. So he says, right, bottom line, says Bet Yosef, that we don't overmeasure this thing, right? וכן כתב המורדכי פרק אלו עוברים, וזה לשונו, מצאתי כתוב בשם הריבה, שאין גודשין, he also says this is Rabbi, that we shouldn't overmeasure the מידה של פסח, כי מאחר שהיא עשירית האפה, so he says, because since it's a certain measure, right, 1/10 of an ephah, Nilmadena Michel Kohen Gadol, we're going to learn from the high priest, Shaita Midato Kimo, like this was his size also, he would bring a meal offering. Kimo Ken Asita Efa, right? V'haya Gudsha Betocha, Kedaminan Bepek Shte Midot, Ad Kaneshano. V'afa Pi She'en Rayato, Raya Deika Lemigmar, Miatam Ifcha, Hu Deika Lemigmar. Teatam Hainu Lomar, Sheota Mida Haita, גדולה כל כך שכשהייתה נמחקת היה בה עשירון גדוש מכל מקום לעניין הדין כיוון שהוא מסכים לדעת תנ"ך רבתה אחי נקטינה. Okay, so bottom line is like this, right? That he's saying that this is the way we paskin, that we go, not with overmeasure, we just go straight measure. וזה לשון אורחות חיים, that's what it says in אורחות חיים, מותר לנדות הגודשים מידותיהם מפסח. So he says, right, that the ones who overmeasure, he says, for Passover, wow. He says, right, you can excommunicate these people. So in other words, they're not doing properly by overmeasuring. כתוב עוד שם, אם אינו לש אלא isaron אחד. So he says, if he only needs that this amount of one isaron, and צמצם כל כך בשיעור, you shouldn't be so precise with the measure. He says, שמא לא יהיה שם שיעור, because maybe it won't be the right proper size. כשיברך על הפרשת חלה, so when you bless on right separating the chala, תהיה ברכה לבטל, it's going to be investing in vain. עד כאן יש לנו. כתב הקולבו, says the kolbo, יש לפקפק בזה השיעור. So he says it's a little bit, this measure is a little bit, right, he says a little bit objectionable, right, a little bit inaccurate. אם נשאר באותו כלי, מחזיק אותו המים, בקמח רפוי שקוראים שונול, סונול, או בעצור או מחובץ כקוראים קלקט. So he says, there's also another question which comes out, right? Question is, right, when we measure this measure, do we use like very tightly packed flour or more like loosely packed, which is going to come out to be a larger size? Okay, interesting. So that's the end of it. So we'll do a Shulchan Aruch and we'll stop. So we saw a lot of different approaches here, right, regarding this issue. But it seems like the conclusion is that we don't overmeasure. So says the Shulchan Aruch, "En la'ashin lePesach isa gedola mishiur chala." So he says, right, when it comes to Passover, right, we shouldn't make the dough larger than challah, right? In other words, the size of challah. So what is the size of challah? By the way, nowadays, right, the rule is, I posted it, by the way, about this already. The rule is that when it comes to challah, what size of dough makes you obligated to take challah? We're talking about 3.5 pounds. So if you have 3.5 pounds, you need to take challah with a blessing. So that's what we're talking about here. Even though in the beginning, right, we thought that it was a little bit larger, 5 pounds, whatever, right? But according to Rambam, it comes out to be 3.5 pounds. The way he measured it. According to the derhem, right, which is the Egyptian measure, as we said. So therefore, the rule is, right, also when it comes to making matzot, right, when you make the dough to make matzot, don't make it larger than 3.5 pounds. This is the maximum. Good. Shehi mem gimel betzim bechomesh, right? So how much is that? As we said, right? It's 43 and 1/5 of an egg. Right? 43 eggs and 1/5 of an egg. Okay, interesting. Yeah. We're talking about medium-sized eggs, right? When you go to the store, right, you buy the large, the jumbo, right, the medium. So here he's talking about medium. The truth is, that many poskim say, there's several poskim, that the eggs of our generation are already smaller, So therefore, they say, right, that it's not the good old days, when the eggs used to be much larger. Okay, it is what it is, right? But anyway, we do measure with the eggs, though, still, right, of our time. That's what it says in the Khatam Sofer, that we should use the measurements of our time, even though things have gotten smaller. Right, but according to Rambam, as we said, right, it's like a fixed measure, because he measured it in his time. He did like a measurement, and he came up with, as we said, right, about 3.5 pounds, which is about 1.6 kilo, right, about approximately that size. So this is what makes you obligated in challah. This is also the maximum size of your matzah dough, right? That's what we're saying. Okay, good. So he says that's isaron, right? The size. This size is called isaron. וכן יישאר אותה ימלא כלי מים וירא מים ממנו לכלי האחר, right? So he says, right, how do you measure it? As we said, right, you do like a displacement test with water, right? ואחר כך ייתן מים ג' ביצים והחזיר בו המים שירא ממנו והמים שיוותרו יתנם בכלי אחר והכלי המחזיק אותה הוא עמידה למלאותו מקמח, right? So all this displacement test that he talks about here doing, the Rambam already did it for us, so it turned out to be, as we said, right, 3.5 pounds. So we don't need to do now another displacement test in our times. We just rely on this measure, and that's good enough, right? והמידה מחוקה ולא קדושה. Right, so right, the Shulchan Aruch says, as we mentioned, right, like the Rashba said, right, which is that you should not overmeasure this measure, right? It should be, even measure. Not overmeasured. Not over the top, as they say, right? Okay. ושיעורה מקמח חיטה מצרית. Tav Kuf Derhem, right? Mitzvit Kiruv. So he says, right, that again, he brings the measurement of the Rambam, right? So he says, right, when we're talking about 122 dirhem, right? And we said, right, each dirhem is 3 grams. So what are we talking about? Right, we're talking about 500. I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. Excuse me. We're talking about 520 dirhem. So times that by 3, right? What do you get? You get 1.6 kilos, exactly what we said, right? Which is 3.5 pounds. So that's how we do it. So this is the maximum. This is also the size of challah, right? So what does that mean? If you're making chalot for Shabbat, right? Whatever. So if you have 3.5 pounds of dough, you're going to take challah, right? And make a blessing on that. So says the Ramah here, velo yidachek hakemach b'midah, right? So he says, Timken lo yalush yafeh. וטוב לומר בשעת נתינת קמח למידה שעושה לשם מצווה. So he said, right, 2 things over here, the Ramah says. Interesting, right? So he says when you put in the amount of, right, the amount of flour that you need, don't push it in tight, don't shove it in there. Don't press it down. Why is that? Because if you press it down, right, what's going to be is you won't need it well. It won't knead well because it's too packed up, concentrated. It's too tight. So therefore, what he says, Ramah, right, what you should do is, all right, just put it in nice and loose, that's the way to do it, right? Not tight. And also, he says another thing is that when you're making this dough, right, when you're making this matzah dough, you should say you're doing it for the sake of mitzvah, right? We already mentioned this before, right? That you should do, when you make it, you should say, I'm making it for the mitzvah of matzah, right? So this way, you're getting credit for doing the mitzvah as well, of making these matzot for the mitzvah of matzah. Okay, very good. So I guess we'll stop there. Any questions? Okay, if not, B'ezras Hashem, we'll see you tomorrow.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Can you repeat again the 122 dirhem each?
It's not 122, it's 520.
In total.
520. Yes.
But
which is 1.6 kilo, right? Times it by 3 comes out to be 1.6 kilo.
Okay. And the 122, what was that all about?
That was a mistake. I'm sorry. I didn't say it right. It wasn't 120. It was 520.
520. Thank you very much.
No, forget about the 120.
Thank you.
120 is only for age, right? You want to be until 120. That's
Thank you.
Okay. 520.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, God bless. So yeah, that's what you need for challah. Okay, very good. So B'ezras Hashem, we'll see you tomorrow. Chazak u'baruch. Laila tov.
Thank you so much.
All the best.